Hello and welcome back to the Dreaming and Doing podcast. I am here today with Jeff Borschowa. He is a Renaissance man who loves knowledge and community. And my guess is that you are wondering, what exactly does that mean that he's a Renaissance man? So I am going to welcome Jeff and I am going to let him tell us a little bit more about him and his background.
Awesome. Well, first of all, Melissa, thank you for having me on your show. I usually use the word polymath, but most people don't know what that means. So I realized at some point I'm a Renaissance man, and all that means is I'm curious about the world around me, and I love things. I love playing with words. I love building relationships. So I learn from the people I hang out with, and really that's kind of my job, if you will. I'm a ghostwriter. So for me, I think it behooves me to be very curious about the world around me. And, one of my favorite topics is artificial intelligence, building community, writing books, podcasting. Um, Most people I know, they're really good at one thing, but I'm really good at probably five things, and I can't ever pick my favorite. So I jump back and forth. And the beautiful thing about being curious about the world is I bring really bizarre perspectives back to my day job. So that's my version. I was trying to figure out what Jeff is and what he does, and I realized, I'm a big fan of the masters, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and I've spent most of my life studying them. So I realized I'm probably one of them.
Yes. Well, I'm really looking forward to our conversation today because we're going to talk about one of the things that I really love, which is community and relationships, and something that I know you love that is really a hot topic right now, which is AI.
Absolutely.
And interestingly enough, you love building authentic relationships and community, and we were introduced by someone that we both know. Our friend Katie said, "Hey, Melissa, you need to meet Jeff." And when I looked at your information online, sure enough, there it was that you love building relationships and community. It ended up being the thing that we talked about when we first met. So tell me a little bit about your love of building community and why you think it's important to build authentic relationships in business.
Absolutely. And that's a wonderful question. A lot of people ask me, how did I get started in that? And I realize it's just been there. It was like I was born with it. I've always loved bringing people together. And, really, really simple example. When I was a kid, you'd have somebody who had a baseball, somebody who had a bat, somebody who had gloves, bring them together. All of a sudden, we're playing baseball. And honestly, I was always bored. I needed something to do. So for me, I realized that bringing people together was a great way to do it. And so I took me years, and I'm going to credit Bob Berg and his book, The Go-Giver. I read it, and then there's a character in there called the Connector. And I didn't sleep for days. I was like, oh my God, that's who I want to be. How do I become that person? And I've spent pretty much every waking moment since then figuring out, how do I get better at networking? How do I get better at connecting? How do I manage the relationships? And so to me, that was kind of where it all started. And what I realized, and this is a terrible thing to admit, but for a while I tried to do traditional marketing and sales, and I learned how to overcome objections. I learned all of that really manipulative stuff. And I'm like, this just feels yucky. I don't want to do it. And what I realized was that my people are generally professionals, they're accountants. They don't want to get better at marketing and sales. And I looked at how I'd been successful in life and how they're successful. And the commonality was, time and time again, building authentic relationships. And I talked to a lot of people who say, well, I went networking and, I handed out 50 cards and I didn't get a single client. Your ideas are terrible. And I'm like, no, it's your execution. And you and I are a perfect example. Katie and you had a conversation, and she said, "Oh my God, you got to meet Jeff." And she came to me and said, "You're going to love Melissa." And the reality is, you and I connected because of our connection around Katie. So to me, it's smarter and lazier at the same time to build relationships that become business, as opposed to everybody shows up and says, "Hey, Melissa, I got widgets. How many would you like?" Well, none. But if you ask me, do you know anybody who wants widgets? Maybe the answer is, yeah, go talk to my neighbor. But too many people want to sell. And if you don't buy on the first conversation, they move on. Whereas I have conversations with people that I've known for decades, and whenever they change jobs or I change opportunities, it's always a chance to reconnect and say, okay, who do I know that needs to be, for example, us having this conversation, who do I know that needs to meet Melissa and be on her show?
Yes. And I'm wondering, because as you were talking, networking and networking events were totally jumping into my head as you were talking. And then you were like, yes, and networking events, for example, right? Because I think about that and how the intention sometimes of networking events is to build relationships. And yet I think the authentic relationships that you're talking about don't always get formed in that way. And so I'm wondering, for you, as you think about the cultivation or efforts to cultivate authentic relationships, what are some things that you have seen really work?
Awesome. And I'm going to give you a really terrible example because it kind of highlights it. A lot of people think networking and, it's kind of like speed dating. They got to talk to as many people as they can. And yet, if you're looking for a deep, meaningful relationship, you're not going to find it at speed dating. I'm sorry. You may build one out of it, but that's the problem. People show up thinking they're going to find the right person, but they're looking in the wrong place. And so I think that the biggest tool is, looking at the person you're connecting with as a human being first. And that's where I always start is, what are you interested in? Where are you? What, and my favorite question is, whatever somebody is, how did you become that person? What choices led you here? Why, why did you decide to become an accountant? Why did you decide to become a counselor? I can't stress enough, but the question mark is the most important tool for building relationships. You ask questions, and the other part, listen to the answer.
Yes. Well, and I love that example, right? Because I love hosting gatherings. Like, I'm regularly offering opportunities for people in our community to come together. And just last night was one of those gatherings that I hosted. And I was actually getting a little bit nervous. Like, it just seemed like things weren't panning out. I had people someone emailed me earlier on in the week. We already had a very small group, and someone was like, "Oh, I'm not going to be able to make it because this." Two other people messaged me, they were sick. And so I was like, oh man, we're going to be a really small group. Like, should I even go ahead and do this? Should I just go ahead and cancel? Like, I don't want people to feel bad because it's a small group that we're having. But honestly, at the end of the night, I told my partner, I said, I think that was one of my favorite gatherings. Yeah. We had only 4 people, but we got to sit down by a fire, have a hot beverage, and we actually got to have meaningful conversation about our families, our work, things like workplace harassment and bullying. And so it just felt really different than the speed dating that you're talking about.
And I think that's, the reality is there's a place for everything. And, I'll give you another real example for me. It's almost every industry. You go to the big conferences and all the people, go sit and listen to the speaker. And then, they rush past the booths of the vendors so they get to the food, and then they rush back, and everybody's so focused on where they're supposed to be and what they're supposed to do. Nobody's having conversations. So one of the things I do when I go to a conference, I'll skip a session, tell anyone, and I'll go hang out in the vendor hall and I meet all of the vendors. Because one of the things I realized is that if they're there, they care about the audience. And really they're more likely to know what's going on with that particular industry than anyone else in the building, maybe even more so than the speakers up on stage. So I always do that. And then when there's breaks, I'll run into somebody I know and I'll say, oh my God, you need to come over here. You were telling me yesterday how much this problem bothered you. I'll drag them over to the vendor and I'll say, look, this person solves your problem. Just talk. And I realized just that little change, skipping one session, because at the end of the day, you get thousands of things thrown at you. I made a difference to my friend and to the vendor.
Yeah. And again, connecting.
Yeah. And, you do that 10 times over. That's a pretty productive event because I've met and gotten to know 10 vendors and I've added value to 10 people that I already know. And I think that's the other piece I'll say is a lot of people seem to think that networking is somehow I win, you lose. But the reality is, Katie connected us. And every time you and I connect, we both recognize Katie for bringing us together. So her value goes up in both of our world because of that.
Yes. I know. We're going to have to share this with her.
Hi, Katie.
So, Jeff, you have an international audience, and during the pandemic, of course, there's conversation about things like what is better, in person or online, for relationships and all of that. And I'm wondering, when you're working with an international community, how do you maintain relationships when you're working with people from all over?
That's a great question. And just for the record, I'm really, really stubborn. And when COVID hit and the world shut down, people told me networking is dead. And they also said you can't network on Zoom or online on video conference. And the stubborn little child in me said, watch me. And so I think I pivoted faster than a lot of the big organizations just because I can. But I immediately, and I went wide at first, which by the way, there's challenges there. I've learned there's certain places in the world I don't need to be. I don't need to be in every time zone, for example. But what I did find was that being virtual really expanded who I could talk to. And really what it comes down to is basic relationship building. It's about connection, communication, curiosity. So I just started hosting. At one point, I had 10 different networking groups across 10 different platforms. And what I ended up doing was adding more people, adding more people. What I found was adding more people, it kind of got big and out of hand and unwieldy. And then what I started to do was fine tune it and narrow down. So the big thing for me was with COVID, as I mentioned, people told me networking's dead. You can't network online. And I wanted to prove them wrong. So I went overboard, and I'm not kidding, Melissa. I had calls in every time zone imaginable, which by the way, eventually gets exhausting. But what I realized was I had a theory that, and there's no science for this, I believe video conference calls was 80% as effective as in person. I'm happy to say I was wrong. I think it's more like 99.9%. Some of my best friends now and people I've connected with over the last 3 years, I have never met them, and I don't know that I ever will, just because of where they are. But the biggest thing for me was realizing, and this is sort of a business thing, but it's also a human thing. People just want to feel part of something. They want to belong. They want to feel connected. So I focused on ways to bring people together, to add value, to add conversations. And one of my favorite things, and I have a few connecting networking buddies who say, oh, you're doing it wrong. But it works for me, is I'll always ask a question that's personal first. So instead of, people getting up and saying, oh, I'm a therapist, I'm an accountant, whatever, I always ask them, to tell us a fun fact about themselves that, they're proud of, but nobody else knows about. I get them to brag a little, I get them to share something. And really, instead of getting to know one another's businesses, we first get to know one another's personalities.